I think the thing I was most scared of those is the beauty of the world you're describing, where the bubble lets you go deep, like deep into work or deep into love. And like there was and is living with chronic cancer is like the feeling of just being so like desperately in love with the world and not wanting to miss it.
Let's start with the absolute darkest question I have, which is, I was fascinated by this idea because it's something I think a lot about. You were sort of talking about as you're working, I suspect it was your first book, but you're talking about it in this one, where you're sort of like, why work on this thing if I'm going to die? Like, why spend time and energy on something that's as hard and to a certain degree unrewarding while you're doing it as a book? So what is the answer? Because I would love to know. Well,
yeah. And I knew how hard it would be writing a book like that. It was going to be a massive history book, like over 100,000 heavily footnoted words. And I knew how hard it was because I'd done it before. I'd written a massive history of the prosperity gospel, and that took me a decade. And then I realized, oh, this is probably my last fall. And this book will have to go in the early summer for what will probably be my last summer, for a job I'll never get to keep, for reasons that I now have to dig deep for. And it, at first the whole thing seemed absurd, really, truly absurd, because I'd always been so externally driven. I wanted to get tenure at an elite university. I wanted the feeling of the ladder that I was climbing. And then I got talked into it at a conference with two beautiful friends who do the same kind of work. And they said, Kate, you've been kind of talking about this all wrong. You're always framing the historical work you do as like a result of your ambition or your some kind of like quirky hobby at best. But, even if the worst happens, like you're in there. Like the people who love you can find you there.
Sure.
And I guess the way that kind of resonated for me was that that there's like a deep purity to doing something you were made to do. And I happen to believe that ideas bear up the weight of civilization, and they don't have to be mine. But I do think that idea work, which is like, especially I love the work of deep history, is inherently valuable, and that I happen to be good at it, but that only about 500 people read those books. So that was the math equation I ran, but it came out to a feeling of deep calling.
Did it change your relationship with the work, the sort of transition from external motivation to intrinsic, I might not even be around to experience the rewards motivation?
Yeah. I think I had to figure out too if it could even fit in the course of a day, because what I was imagining was a mountain of work, and I was going to, in a way, have to be like in full beast mode to do it, so that I would have to get up 2 hours earlier. I'd have to know exactly how many words a day. I would have to slog and then toggle fast where I could put it down, turn toward momming a little smushy baby, and then not being a dick to my family and friends, like having enough left to then also be doing almost full-time, like chemo, immunotherapy, sad cancer things. And so, but the beautiful feeling was the second I'd done it in the day, I used to send it to my dad, who's also a historian, and then he would read it over and we would sort of chew over little bits of things. But the feeling then of having that shared work where someone's kind of keeping pace beside you, that felt like we were digging out like a deeper part even of being together. So it wasn't then just intellectually satisfying. It felt like I was not alone, and being able to simultaneously make it like a gift, like a family project.
Sure. And when the sort of looming specter of death diminishes slightly, does that go away, or were you able to carry it forward on these two books?
I find death is very weird. Not that I've really fully been there, but I've almost been there a couple times. And it's almost like it's almost like volume dials, Like the volume of some things gets turned way up, and then other it just feels very dreamy and far away. So that and for me, work has always helped me kind of adjust the dials of my life. So I had to spend so much time in the hospital, and I just didn't want to. I knew I had to be there. Like, you have to get blood work done. You have to be nice to your nurse. Not everyone has to force their nurse to pretend to be a vampire, but that's what I did, and pretended he wanted to be left alone with my blood. And that's what I needed to get through those days. But I also wanted to be somewhere else and still myself. So I used to conduct interviews all the time in the cancer center.
Wow.
And have people stop by for I had hundreds of people to interview for that dumb book.
Yeah.
So I was like, hey, I'm really busy. You should come on by. But it was so lovely to see the way people are truly themselves while in the midst of you being truly yourself. So anyway, so that was very intense and felt really meaningful. But then what? Like, what do you do if you kind of have more time to spend? And I realized that I realized I needed to toggle between a couple different ways of being, that I needed to write to tell the truth, which was the beauty of being able to write like memoir and cultural essays.
Sure.
But then the other bit was I needed to write to learn. And so that I would keep flipping back and forth between those kinds of writings just so I could learn how to keep living, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been trying to think about that because I wrote one book during the pandemic. I did one book and a children's book, but it did feel like, especially in the summer of 2020, when things were really crazy, it was this sort of unique period of sort of stillness and quiet where it felt like the volume was turned down, but then the stakes were turned up, and then you weren't expected to do anything. So it sort of was like waking up like on a Sunday every day, and if you made progress, you were ahead because most people were not doing anything. And as I've been working on the next book since then, everyone's sort of talking about things going back to normal. I'm not sure if I really want them to go back to normal. Whatever that was felt better to me than normal. Yeah.
Did you like I'm just wondering if it felt like that deep end feeling, like you can, like in the arc of a day, you can kind of dive deeper under the water.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And like, there was so much less to say no to because most of the stuff you have to say no to was like illegal, like temporarily, like coffee or travel or whatever. Like, I've flown a couple times in the last month, the sort of first travel I've done since the pandemic for work stuff. And it's like, oh, I'm used to working where I'm not doing anything and nothing's going on. Yeah. And now I'm having to adjust to a sort of a busier world. I imagine that as traumatic and terrible as cancer was, it was a bubble, like literally and figuratively, where you were that was your life, and everything else in the external world, you just didn't have time for. So I do intermittent fasting, which means I try to have 16 to 18 hours between meals. So when I decide to eat, it's kind of a weird window for me. Like, it's not quite time for lunch, but it's too late for breakfast. So one of the things I always like to eat first is some sort of like protein bar, something that gives me some sustained energy that keeps me going, especially when I'm writing, because writing's such a mentally taxing thing. Today's episode is sponsored by UCAN. Their super starch energy bars are really good. They give you a sustained amount of energy without spiking your blood pressure, which not only isn't good, if your blood pressure spikes, then you get a crash afterwards. So there's none of that. It's sustained, great energy that holds me over through the day, lets me focus on what I do, lets me write my stuff, lets me interview people here on the Daily Stoic podcast. UCAN is giving 30% off your first order right now with promo code STOIC at checkout. This is the salted peanut butter one. It's really good. If you go to ucan.co/stoic, you get 30% off your first order, ucan.co/stoic.
I think the thing I was most scared of those is the beauty of the world you're describing, where the bubble lets you go deep, like deep into work or deep into love. And like there was and is living with chronic cancer, is like the feeling of just being so like desperately in love with the world and not wanting to miss it.
Because it could go away. You have a sense of its ephemerality.
The precarity of it does feel very bright.
Yeah.
But But a lot of cancer is, and a lot of pain or suffering is not just deep, it's horrifyingly, mind-numbingly mundane. It's feeling foggy and being mad at yourself for feeling sleepy. It's being worried about being medically bankrupt because this is a country that bankrupts sick people.
Sure.
It was fighting with insurance companies over bills that were, so that was that wasn't just like the dross. Sometimes the suffering, I think most of suffering, turns out it's just paperwork.
Yeah.
that feels,
Kafkaesque.
Yes, exactly. That feels like just such a punishment. Like, wait, this is my existential finish line. I want to be doing the stuff that matters. And instead I'm talking to Linda from HR to see why this bill came to me.
No, that was something that my sister sort of told me about that I didn't think about. It's just like how long you have to spend in the hospital. That, chemotherapy doesn't take 20 minutes. It takes like an hour of setup, and then it takes 2 hours, and then it's an hour of this, and then you can't drive, and then the next 2 days the idea that it involves so much waiting, I don't think is something people would anticipate.
Yeah. What does your sister do?
She works in education, but she had breast cancer about 3 years ago.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. She's doing good now, but the idea of just like, yeah, and then also I guess the hell of the logistics.
Yes.
Of like who's going to drive me, and you talk about this in the book, just the flights, and I could the anger you felt when you were like, oh, I could have been doing it at Duke this whole time.
Yes. Yeah. When my life became a clock, I didn't really take too kindly to people wasting it.
Right.
And especially when, I'm a professor at Duke University.
Right.
So when I found out that Duke University Hospital was offering the treatment I would need to live, I was so confused. I guess because turns out we're not just suffering, we're participating in this bigger thing called biocapitalism, and we're like caught in structures. And I think that's part of what makes you have to give up heroic individualism as a patient pretty fast, is you're like, oh, there's me and the dignity of my many choices. Yeah. and then you realize, oh no, I'm in a trial, and the trial has rules, and the rules have sponsors, and there's a whole lot of things deciding what the next few months and years of my life will be, and it's not me.
Yeah, you're like the private in a mass army, and they're sending you around, and they don't really, this isn't about individuals at all. And so but to you are an individual, and in the primacy of your life and death struggle, you're the most important individual.
I'm like trying so hard to live this hero's journey, but instead I'm just like this sad peon who's like, does anyone just the cupbearer for all of these? I think that's what's so hard, when so much of what I was trying to do is give up on this hyper agency that I'd gotten so hooked on. And I did not like being subject all the time to the things I couldn't pick. It does not suit my personality, and I did not enjoy it.
But that there's some irony, I guess, in that, because obviously as a Christian, but you talk about everything happens to a reason. Part of Christianity is about surrender. So, and we can talk about that in the abstract, but then when surrender means Linda from HR is in charge, that's a different pill to swallow.
Well, especially lovingly and respectfully about Americans, but like American culture, especially American Christianity, is obsessed with individualism, telling and shaping their own faith story. I mean, not even our Calvinists aren't even Calvinists anymore. Everybody believes that since everyone drank from the deep wells of the revolution, everybody is positive that they are rugged individualists bootstrapping their way to a different story. And in faith, that has had some really strange consequences for Christianity. Is faith became a set of certainties that people take on. Eventually it became a belief that, try telling anybody in church that if you become a Christian, your life might actually get worse. And,
right.
It's absolutely countercultural.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah, like the paradox of faith is that it's about belief, but then that becomes certainty, or that has sort of metastasized into a kind of certainty that doesn't leave a lot of room for other people to have different beliefs or situations.
Well, yeah, I think that the math that starts to get run is a kind of obsessive futurism. So because in this story that Jesus' death and resurrection saves the world, God is drawing us toward a story of love in which all things will be made right. And then therefore, and so it goes like, and then therefore, heaven makes today not just bearable, but it makes it impossible then for you to complain. Or if you say, I'm really scared, like I'm really scared right now, then like, oh, God didn't give us a spirit of fear. So the futurism becomes a huge burden for people who are just trying to say that the life takes more courage than we expected. And I think like in the balance, here's my guess about me and you, Ryan. My guess is you and I agree a lot about courage. My guess is we disagree about hope. But I think that in this version, that the people who are especially hopeful are obsessed with a future that I'm asking them to give up a little bit of certainty about.
Interesting. Well, our mutual friend Seneca says that hope and fear are the same, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about it.
Tell me more.
Well, that they're both sort of about what the future will be. There's some sense either of dread of the future or certainty about the future or an expectation for the future, instead of dealing with that kind of painful ambiguity of the present moment or an uncertain future. Yeah.
I love that. I love the framing of the existential cliff that Stoicism is so good at. I think it rubs against our culture's. I'm trying to pick a nicer word than delusional. Excited, anticipatory habits about always saying that life is supposed to get better.
Yes.
And just to be able to say, we don't know what the future will hold, and we have to learn how to live what's under the burden of that with a little bit more humility, I think.
Well, you talk about that in the book, specifically about the Stoics. You're talking about how they lived in a time of cholera and smallpox and executions and exile and all of that. So it is interesting that then they spent a whole bunch of time going Memento Mori or remember, Seneca talks about never forgetting fortune's habit of behaving exactly as she pleases. So it's weird that people who lived in an uncertain world where tragic, terrible things were happening all the time, certainly at a level greater than it is today, right? Like you're not getting exiled. Even if you're canceled, it just means you don't have a Twitter account or something anymore, right? So like the stakes are so much lower, and yet we don't do any of that. It's weird that they had to do the reminding when the stakes were there and visceral and real. Yeah. And then today, when it's actually much more likely that you would be caught by surprise by one of those things because it's not happening to your neighbor, we're like, oh, I'm fine. I'm prepared. And you're not, I don't think anyone's prepared.
Yeah, I totally agree. Also, I loved how excited you were when you said that. I don't know. This is all this stuff that nobody likes when I say at parties. So I like how excited that you are to say it at this party.
Yes. No, it's people used to, the average person would lose 1 to 2 children in childbirth. And yet, the Stoics are talking about, even thinking about your children's mortality. And then today that's not happening. And we're not taking the time, life isn't reminding you of it, except in these sort of freak instances, or, you're a surprise case for cancer. Mm-hmm. You get basically old man's cancer. And so like of all the people who should be actively preparing, it's us, but we don't do it.
Yeah. And I should have been, I mean, you would think with an expertise like I study the history of people's ideas about suffering and
Yeah.
whether their lives are going to get better. You'd think that someone who'd written for 10 years on that would be slightly less surprised. But I was horrified. I was horrified that it was me. I was horrified that it was my life that came apart. It was awful to be the one that felt like I was just a bomb that went off. But I think had I lived, I mean, 100 years before, I mean, I kept thinking about my, especially in this plague that we've just been going through, I just keep thinking how short our historical memory is. Like my grandparents knew. My grandma had been sent away to a sanitarium with tuberculosis. And she was, I mean, the smartest person in their family, was just about to do what no one else had done in my family and get a college degree. And she suddenly catches this wildly infectious errant disease, and she's put behind glass. And even when she miraculously is allowed to leave, they had to cut out most of the tissue of her lung, and she spent the rest of her life in and out of quarantine, basically having to put her own children in the foster care system when she couldn't care for them. And I think, man, my grandma knew. It was just my parents forgot, and then I forgot.
Seneca has tuberculosis too. He has to spend 10 years basically in Egypt convalescing. And it's right as he basically becomes a lawyer, gets tuberculosis, has to spend 10 years. He comes back, reinvents himself as a politician. Then he gets exiled, spends another 10 years. So yeah, it is interesting. We talk about like things going back to normal, and it's like, actually this stuff is very normal. Yes. This is like, show me some decade or some human life long enough where this stuff doesn't happen. I mean, exactly 100 years ago, we had the Spanish flu.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And even, I mean, I'm an American historian, and I mean, when I was giving my sort of like the big lecture series, I didn't even include the history of plagues, because I don't think I imagined. I was mostly trying to tell this story about democracy and choice and the idea of Americans' concept of self-making. I really wish I would have told the history as its equal and opposite, as the story of our fragile selves, the story of our desperate attempts to control what can't be controlled, and how very quickly we forget, especially when we get all, whipped up on our certainties.
Yeah, I mean, for me, reading the Stoics, like I'd read Marcus Aurelius probably 100 times, and it never actually resonated with me that he was not only living in a plague, but he writes about the plague several times.
Yeah.
Like I guess I just assumed. So there's one passage that I've talked about a lot, so people are probably tired of hearing about it, but he says, there's two types of plagues. He's like, there's the plague that takes your life. And he says, but the much more dangerous pestilence is the one that destroys your character. And I was like, oh, okay, he's being whatever. I didn't get that he was talking about exactly what we've seen play out on the news for 18 months. Like it just never occurred to me that he could be specifically talking about people and the plague that he was living in. And then, you just sort of get caught by surprise by it. It's kind of strange, the tunnel vision that we get.
I think I had maybe thought about cancer in a similar way, because I really didn't know anybody. Nobody in my family had cancer. There was no sense that I was genetically predisposed to anything. Sure. And so I assumed it was a thing that unlucky people get. Don't know why. Right. But it felt, but the more that I have spent time with people who study cancer, and I did this a lovely conversation with the pioneer of bad luck theory in cancer, which was this, and I will, as a historian and not a scientist, struggle to summarize this appropriately, but his name is Christian Tomasetti, and he's a professor at Johns Hopkins, and he had this thought on an airplane an epiphany that that people had not been able to appropriately predict the incidence rate of cancer. So how many people get kidney cancer versus how many people who get bone cancer? And he wondered if, as a statistician, it might have something to do with the rate of cell replication per organ. What an interesting and elegant thought. And so then he decided to map the incidence of cancer with the rate of growth of cells. Mapped it amazingly. It maps beautifully. And so when I'm sitting there with stage 4 stupid colon cancer, and I had been so desperate for a reason for it, I'd been like hungry for a reason because frankly, everywhere I went, people blamed me for it. Like it's different than brain cancer. Because if you have colon cancer, you assume you get all the people who, all the goop people, right? All the essential oil smoothie people. And
it was what you were eating. It's something in the air. It's the environmental or somebody's fault. It's probably mine. And didn't I, it was just like a deep curiosity as if I'm like sleeping next to a mattress factory every day and drinking directly from the environmental. Right. And I am. And when because I guess I had been struggling honestly with just this like hyper causality that happens when you suffer. Why? Sure. And also, I had recently had a nurse blame me for what I'd eaten on the way into like a recent procedure. She looked at my chart and she was like, "Well, must be something you ate." And I was like, "Oh, well, I'm in a hospital gown. I'm feeling a little tender right now. Maybe you could stop tacitly calling me fat." But when the researcher Christian Thomasetti, he looked at me and he goes, "Oh, well, Kate, I mean, cells duplicate and cells in the colon duplicate at a higher rate. So, my dear, there's not necessarily like a reason. You're just deeply unlucky." And when I started thinking about cancer cells being, cells that try to fix themselves, cells that try to duplicate, of just living inside of chance itself, I felt like I was able to accept the chaos of it in a way that I don't think I would have been able if he hadn't joyfully pronounced me deeply unlucky. So what's the difference between being deeply unlucky and everything happens for a reason? It's the same nonsense, right?
Well, it depends. I mean, I've only read a little bit about the history of luck, but it really all depends if you've applied it's almost like I think of it as if you're living in a closed universe or not. Okay. If you're living under not an open sky, a closed ecosystem, in which every single thing like karma has to either come back to you in some way or another, every action gets a reaction, then everything has to be overly hyper interpreted. And I think depending on your theory of luck, one of the lovely explanations is that it's not an explanation at all, is that something surprising happens and it has a happy outcome. You're lucky. But neither of those things are a story about your character or a story about, and sometimes they are, but allowing there to be a little bit more ambiguity there is like something I really do a lot of work around, because it's like a deep hope I have that it'll make us more charitable, I think.
When even unlucky is a bit of a story then, right? It's just that was just your luck, right? Like probabilistically it can happen. So it did happen. And that's why you're in the mess you're in.
It does get a little pluriverse with theories of luck, because it really kind of depends on whether or not you've decided what the rules of the game are. Like, for instance, one theory of luck is that when a system operates the way it should, you're not lucky. You're just, it's the natural outworking. So, for instance, you could just be, if I'm an affluent white person entering a healthcare in a certain position and it works to my advantage, I'm not lucky. It's just the outworking of the system and the way it's designed. But in this, because I study religious causality, I guess part of the burden has been in being like an overinterpreted person, Like I'm always like a spiritual problem to be solved, or this
is how people are seeing you.
Yeah, because I can't. Otherwise, if what happened to me was just random, then it might happen to them.
Or they might have to, like, let's say I think this is a problem we have politically in the United States with, some of the issues that we obviously have to solve, whether it's like, let's say mass shootings. If you can respond to this with everything happens to a reason or thoughts and prayers, then you don't have to address it, right? And so I think you're talking about some of the inequities in the healthcare system, or the fact that you can be bankrupted for the bad luck of having cancer. If this is just something that can happen to someone, and that it happens with an alarming amount of regularity, then we have to do something about it. If it's God's will, then we can just feel bad for that person and not have to change. And that's the thing I think people struggle with, even with Stoicism, this idea of like, what's in our control, what's not in our control. That doesn't mean that you just look at all the horrible things happening in the world and you go, glad it's not me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The courage to act. I hear that.
Or the courage to actually sit and wrestle with the discomfort of bad things happen to good people, and that could happen to me.
Ryan, we don't want to live in reality, though. Wouldn't we? What a terrible idea. These are awful. You must be terrible at kids' birthday parties.
Yes. I would say one of the upsides of the pandemic has been fewer kids' birthday parties.
Yeah. What do you mean? Standing near strangers, watching children blow on food?
Not having to do 7 one day, the back to back. I've enjoyed that. So talk me through your introduction to the Stoic, because that's actually how I found you. My sister had sent me an article that you'd written in the New York Times about your cancer diagnosis, where you talked about Seneca, I believe. So how does that introduction happen?
Well, I was being talked out of it by my lovely colleague, Warren. So I teach at Duke University's wonderful do-gooders who lead local congregations. And I was really struggling with the idea that the future just felt, I could hear it in the way that I couldn't talk. I couldn't speak casually anymore with people. They'd always say, "Oh, we should do that in the summer," or like, "Let's go to," or even just like complaining about, "Oh, it'll be years until I'd ever get to retire." Like, we're all 12 years old,
right?
And I could feel it like catch in my throat, and I knew that I didn't sort of belong to the future anymore.
You were dealing with different time horizons than everyone else.
Yeah, and it felt. Yeah, it felt like I was locked out of a world that I had once very casually visited. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but I was talking to my adorable friend Warren, who like is forever in a clerical collar. Just like it's like I've seen him come out of the gym. I don't even understand where he keeps it. And I was like, "Warren, do you think that but he could tell I was really, I said, I think I'd like to give up on the future." And he said, "Well, would you agree that like to live is to live without the like an anxious dependent on like what is to come?" Something like that. And I was like, "Yes, wait, is this a trap? Please tell me that Jesus said this." And he was like, "Oh no, that was Seneca." And he was like, "But we Christians are meant to be people of hope." And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." The future is like an abyss. And I guess I was trying to, I'm not an expert in, I'd have to rummage through my philosophy minor in my undergrad to like be any good at this, though I did learn Latin and was not bad at it for a bit. But I was trying to figure out the nature, like what is the nature of Christian hope if hope isn't optimism? I'd spent so long studying the history of positive thinking, and I really couldn't figure out frankly, Rand, I couldn't figure out what the difference was.
Sure.
So that's what I was struggling through.
Interesting. Yeah. You know what one of the things that really struck me a couple of years ago was realizing that Seneca and Jesus are both born in roughly the same year, both in provinces of the Roman Empire. Both ultimately die. One dies a little later than the other, but both die sort of at the hands of the state. And then both probably are more impactful after their death than during their death or during their life. But it is weird to think like these two guys were walking around the earth at the same time, saying relatively similar things.
There's like, there's such a meld, like for centuries, there's like the impact of Stoicism on Christianity was significant. I think obviously one believes that a guy died and then was the only person to get resurrected really, and then stay resurrected.
Yes.
Sorry, Lazarus. And that resurrection tells us something about the salvation of the world. I guess the difference there is, I think one of the similarities that I feel, and is about the way that both Stoicism and Christianity have a lovely cyclical view of time.
Mm-hmm.
Like it has
it's a circle, you say in the book.
Yeah. It's it doesn't just I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings of our culture's current obsession with the be present mindset.
Yeah. Well, the other two Stoicism Bible things, Seneca's brother's in the Bible, which I've always found to be really interesting.
Oh, really?
Yeah. His brother is Gaio, or Gallo. I don't know how you pronounce it, but, and then if you told me that Marcus Aurelius was actually the author of Ecclesiastes, I would buy that.
Yeah.
They're basically the same.
It's got real vibe.
Yeah. No, I think the present thing is interesting because there's almost like a certain emptiness to it, like the Zen idea of presence, like you have no self, think nothing, just be present. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's that meaningful, or I don't know. There's almost something nihilistic I found in that, in this sort of Zen approach. To me, I like the idea of just very much breathing the present moment in, like seeing the world like the way that an artist or a child would see the world, which is that it's perfectly sufficient. It's wonderful as it is, even when it's ugly, even when it's mundane. And to not need it to be anything different than it is. To me, that's where you want to get, which is when you just say be present isn't quite capturing what we're talking about. Yeah.
It sounds like you're arguing for a deeper acceptance and the granularity of reality.
Yeah. I talk in my stillness book, I talk about Maria Abramovic, and she does that art installation where she sits in a chair every day for like 50 consecutive days.
Yes.
And like, as she's sitting there, people will, they would rotate, people would come, and like you watch some people like sit across from her and she has said and done nothing, and they just burst into tears. Just the being in the presence of someone who is present was almost more than they could bear. And I found that to be very poignant.
Yeah. You always know, don't you? When
old people have that vibe very often. It's the grandparent vibe.
Yes, totally. That is a deep magic, is being willing to be surprised and then changed by the people you actually encounter. That's a kind of hype, like just that started for me, I think, with my diagnosis, mostly because because the future was taken away in such an intense way. And then I needed to be surprised in my day because the day wasn't sufficient.
I found during the pandemic, just a sort of an overwhelm of emotions of just like, this is sort of it. This is enough. Yeah. It's not going to be anything different. It could be like this forever. It could end tomorrow. Like life itself could end tomorrow. It was a sort of a weird feeling that I haven't been quite able to shake, of just like, sort of really fully being engaged in life in a way that you're not when you're doing 50 things at the same time.
Yeah. That's such a, when life can't be wide, and then just to make it deep, like just to keep letting the new details of it. I was in quarantine 9 times though, because of I was in Canada, and every time I was in quarantine 9 times though, Ryan. And I will tell you, on the 9th, I felt less in love with the details of my small student rental in Winnipeg, Manitoba, I'll tell you.
That's interesting. So we live out in the country and then decided to sort of take it very seriously and just never, because I don't have to see anyone for work, and neither does my wife. We just sort of have been on one long quarantine, like sort of ever since. And so it was really sort of surreal and beautiful, but that was something I was going to ask you. So when you have this sort of, you talked about the volume being turned down and the volume being turned up on some stuff, but then as you come out of the diagnosis or into the remission or whatever the sort of weird thing they call it.
I know. I'm not even cancer. It's not even remission. I'm just sort of like, I now pronounce you cancer-y.
You're good for now.
Yeah. I'm cancer adjacent.
Yes. How do you like, cause I've been struggling with this, like on the couple, like there was stuff I agreed to when it was like hot back summer and we thought life was going back to normal. And then now it's like a little weird, especially here in Texas, but like I've been having trouble doing mundane things that are like it's like, I'm supposed to miss bedtime for this fucking conference call, or like I have to go to the DMV. Like, how could someone steal 1 hour of my time for such a, how do you go back to just regular life?
Yeah, that's right. That's the
thing. Yeah. How have you adjusted?
I love this. You're right. Because there is kind of a brittleness to it.
Yeah.
Where you're like, fuck you, I'm being existential right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. She said as a Christian. Yeah, I guess it did sort of help me when my friend Luke was in his work. He like talks about different kinds of experiences of time, and that basically just describing to me that the one in which I've been living was tragic time. That like there's a, which was we've all been in the pandemic, that the stakes have been elevated, the both gratitude and intensity of the todays and the yesterdays become kind of overwhelming, and also, like an overlap, but not always related, is like apocalyptic time. I mean, I hope we've all read accounts of people who believed that the very end of the world was on them, and that they had stark binaries that they imagined, and that gave them a kind of crisp clarity about what was intolerable and what they would give everything to have in their lives, and then there's just ordinary time. And
that's the pastoral time.
Yeah. That's just the garbage getting up and then figuring out whether your bread has gone moldy for your nice toast. And then, caring about other people, returning phone calls, and then giving up on self-mastery for the moment. And I find I have such a deep, I think, Ryan, this is why we have like a secret and immediate, friend assumption, at least on my part, is like a deep intolerance of ordinary time.
Yeah.
Don't tell me what to do.
And I think I got very used to having no ordinary time over the last 18 months, and now you're like, what do you mean the flight is 30 minutes delayed? Like, you're stealing this from me and my children, and we'll never get this back.
Ryan, I love that so much. You are robbing me of my lifeblood, which just to say my minutes. And the tick, tick, tick feeling, I really, I feel that so deeply, because I have wanted so desperately to turn all my minutes into moments. And then when people want to change them back, like Cinderella pumpkin style, back into these garbage minutes.
Yeah.
I feel you. Because at first, when I knew that my minutes, like when you said, did you say robbed, stolen? You said stolen from me? Yeah. I was like, you can't take this from me.
Right.
I stood up in the middle a couple months after my diagnosis, everyone had sort of thought I was ready for polite company. Turns out I wasn't. I would like stand up in the middle of work lunches and announce, I don't have time for this. I like rented heavy machinery just to bulldoze things out of sheer joy. I was recently, I promise this is just not related to anything, but poisoned by a copperhead snake. And I was in the hospital being—
Wait, you got bit by a copperhead?
I sure did.
I saw a coral snake this morning. It was very exciting on our morning walk. But so how did it get close enough to bite you?
Well, please don't get bitten because it'll cost you $120,000.
Yeah,
which
right.
is the anti-venom.
Mm-hmm.
I was a block from my house, like a saint, moving a half step off a path for an old man onto a fully mowed bit of grass. Wow. And then I guess, stepped on where it was probably living and having a nice day.
Wow. And
then it bit me, and it really hurt, is like a not surprising subplot of that scenario. But it also meant that I got to walk into a hospital and yell, I've been poisoned, which was one of the funniest things I've ever gotten to say. But while I was stuck in this stupid hospital, I was like, you are robbing me of my Tuesday. And I was high, but I did apparently send a very thoughtful email to somebody asking if they worked with— I was like, I think I remember that you worked with sharks. And then like cut to 2 weeks later, I'm like fishing dinosaurs out of the ocean because I don't like having things be taken from me. And I hear you.
Wow. What happened?
You
have a motion sensor?
Lighting? I do. I also just thought we just might want a little drama.
You write these sort of books about, that appeal to people in times of difficulty, and you sort of never know who they're going to reach. One of the weird experiences for me with the Daily Stoic is somebody gave Billy Bush a copy of the book, like as his life was imploded and destroyed, for a tape that, he basically forgot existed. And, he was not the bad guy on the tape. But
he was kind of the bad guy.
No, I mean, Billy Bush took the weight for our anger at a different person. Right. But anyway, so he loses his job and his livelihood and his reputation. And then he was telling me like 3 weeks later, he's like playing golf with his friends, and his friend like drills him in the head with a golf ball, like off of a drive. Like he nearly dies from that. And it is weird how we think that life is as bad as it could possibly be.
Yeah.
And then it manages to get worse. Yeah. Then you get bit by a copperhead.
Ryan, I'm going to just say this as an aside so that you can fully cut this because you won't want to include it. But Billy Bush absolutely immediately tweeted that everything had happened for a reason, and that he had been taught a lesson by his complicity. Complicity was the word he should have used. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe that's not the right lesson. But I bet he hadn't read your book yet. And so I would have liked to meet him after he read your book. Okay.
Let's actually leave it in, because my favorite part of the book is the appendix, where you translate what we should say instead of that. So I'll let him know that it's not everything that happens for a reason. It says we must learn to face uncertainty with courage, which I love that, right? It's not that it happened for a reason. It's that shit happens and you got to figure out how to navigate through it. Sometimes that shit is your fault. Sometimes it's partly your fault. Sometimes you're not to blame at all.
Yes, that's right. Yes, absolutely.
Why do you think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think people gravitate towards those cliches because they do kind of explain things, but they're also woefully insufficient at the same time. And I do wonder if you ever actually heard one of the Stoics say one of these things to you at the time, you'd be like, shut the fuck up. Like, that is woefully insufficient to the tragedy of my current situation.
I do think that it's part of the beauty and the weight of you can say time-worn truths or you can say cliches, but it's that there's always a little gem in there. Like the beauty of being present is you and I agree that people are magic, and that if you slow down, that time unspools. And that's a weird trick to learn. I think YOLO is a great idea, except of course, if you need to, pay taxes or like
plan a career,
bear the weight of other people's loves and dreams too.
Sure.
Like there's, a whole several 100,000 people right now who are not living their dreams. They're living the dreams of other people by being a caregiver. So we're not all just self-realizing,
yes,
existential hunger monsters.
My favorite one from Seneca that I think about that sort of changed my thinking, and I wonder what your thoughts would be. He says, don't think of death as something in the future. He says, think of death as something that's happening always, like it's happening right now. So like the time that passes belongs to death is basically what he says.
That is nice and dark. Yeah. I like a good crispy darkness.
And so this idea, like, instead of like, like I have 40 years left, it's like, how many years have you lived?
I'm 40 years spent. Yeah.
Yes. And that seems to me an interesting way to think about it, because it's also in our control, right? Like if we go back to the idea of being present, the time you have now, you can choose to live it or not live it, or just let it elapse. Whereas you don't really have control over when the end comes. Yeah.
Yeah. Control really is a drug, and I have loved it.
With your lists and things?
I love my lists. I love my light feeling of wind in my sails. I love the feeling of being on stilts, like your steps but having most of that taken away and still having like what things remain, and unfortunately it is like the deep and beautiful love of others and being a group project. And we all know we hated group projects in high school. So someone's always like, someone who did B- work is always getting an A+.
Yes, your family members are not contributing to the group project as much as
I want to name them right now. Let's get into it. Let's get specific. Who failed me during cancer?
Last thing, because I do think it's interesting to actually hear you, because when you read the books, it's very clear that you have a sense of humor and that you're fun, and that's partly what gets you through this. But I think there is this idea, at least particularly of the Stoics, but I suspect of Christians too, that sort of the study of philosophy, these big ideas, sort of sucks the joy out of everything or sucks the humor out of it. But all the priests that I remember liking growing up were hilarious. And like, I think the Stoics are really funny too. Why is there this idea that this is all like very deadly serious and there's no fun in it?
Yeah, well, partly the ponderous tone we probably use while quoting, but I think the reason why they're funny is because tragedy. Because it's tragedy.
Yeah.
It's like humor and drama and comedy. And it is the deep comedy of our lives.
Better to laugh than cry.
And laughing, really, it helps us tell the truth. It really does. We all know the person who will say it in a group, and that person, and like, that is, it's because we need to practice getting up as close to the edge of the cliff as possible. And imagining we have wings for a moment, which is what comedy does, like helps us feel the upward draft of the air and not just hold our breath.
That's beautifully said. Well, I loved the new book. I loved the other one, which I also read. And I hope there are many more to come.
Ryan, you are such a philosophy nerd, and I love it so much. I would absolutely have been your best friend in college.
Well, I appreciate it. You're a nerd about many things too, and that's what makes you great at what you do.